thing. But most things in life you have to make irrational decisions without having all the information. Like imagine finding a life partner. I want, show me the entire video of my life with this partner, and then I'll decide whether or not I'll choose this partner. That's not going to happen. You jump in, and then there's a big setup cost because you can of course get divorced, but it's kind of higher setup cost. So we do make these irrational decisions. The big things in life are like that.
All right. So, hello and welcome everyone to whoever's listening to this particular podcast. Today we have with us Dr. Subbarao Kambhampati. He's a professor of computer science at Arizona State University, popularly known as Professor Rao. And he's the director of the Yochan lab at ASU, where his research focuses on decision-making and planning, specifically in the context of human-aware artificial intelligence systems. He has received multiple awards for his research contributions, and he has also been named as a fellow of AAAI, AAAS, and ACM, and also a distinguished alumnus from University of Maryland, and also recently was announced distinguished alumnus of IIT Madras. So, Professor Rao, thanks for being here, and good to have you on the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So can you tell us a bit about what got you interested in AI? As in, like, I assume you must have been a PhD student or a master student when you decided to get your hands on AI and get started
No,
with
actually, actually, it was quite earlier than that. You mentioned IIT Madras. So I was a student at IIT Madras during 78, 83. And so I think it was during that time. I was originally, those were the 5-year bachelor's programs. So first 2 years, general engineering, and then the last 3 years, a specific major. So I was originally sort of in the first year, I was in mechanical engineering, then I changed to electrical engineering. And so I actually did electrical engineering as a major. I mean, we used to call it electrical engineering electronics, which was different from electrical engineering power. One is called LC, low current. The other is called HC, high current. The power would be the high current. So I was in the LC, so thankfully I wasn't going to get any shocks. But so I was doing a lot of signal processing, communication theory, etc. And then I did my bachelor's project, BTech project with Professor Bhagavatala Yajnanarayana. He was essentially a speech recognition. He was very much into speech recognition. At that time, he was also into neural networks for a while. And then I did my thesis, bachelor's thesis in speech recognition. I was aware of the DARPA project, DARPA Speech Understanding project, which actually led to a whole bunch of things like Blackboard architecture, etc. And so that was sort of my interest. And that's how I got sucked into generally things around AI. Signal processing is my background. AI is what I was doing. Although I needn't have moved because I think now AI and signal processing are becoming way closer. So sometimes I think that I went from continuous math to discrete math back now to continuous math. And so, yeah, so that's sort of my background as to how I got into AI. So my bachelor's thesis was speech recognition.
Yeah, and I assume it would be much more different than how most of the people nowadays are getting into AI, because it's hard to distinguish between the hype and the actual love for AI. And I assume back in those times, like, nobody was really excited or actually knew about artificial intelligence, right? To be honest.
It's actually a good point. So for the longest time, even when I was in grad school, in AI conferences that I would attend, especially, I would be the only Indian student, like at all. One of the few at any rate. In fact, I knew all the 1 or 2 Indian students in AI because there used to be so few of us. And now it's completely different. I mean, you go to New Rips. In fact, I think the last time I was in person in New Rips, I even tweeted this Simpsons cartoon because the whole place is full of Indian students. So yeah, it's a different thing. Both worldwide interest in AI has exploded now compared to then, and it's also certainly Indian students certainly were not in AI. But I mean, it always had this out there feel. So I joke around that, people used to kind of look at me sadly and say, can't you do something more interesting like databases or, the stuff that gets you jobs? Why are you doing AI? But now I'm told everybody is doing AI. In fact, all those people who used to tell me, why are you doing AI? Come and tell me, Rao, we are doing AI. And so obviously the world has changed. But I think some of the big questions remain the same. I don't think the big questions have changed. Methodologies might change. I think back in 2016, I gave this talk at AAAI. It's available from my YouTube page on the pendulum swings in AI. So methodologically, AI shifted, in different ways. Logic versus probability, symbols versus neurons, and also disappointment versus doomsday, which is basically what we currently are. And I think, but the big questions remain the same, and the intellectual appeal of the field, to me, it has always been that really, there are only three big questions left. Always. And those are three big questions confronting us. Origin of the universe, origin of life, nature of intelligence, right? So to the extent AI is kind of connected to the nature of intelligence, we are talking about one of the three big questions, So, I keep telling my students in the Intro to AI class that when Alan Turing figured out the foundations of computer science, his first question wasn't how big a Excel spreadsheet can I open? His first question was, can machines think? So it's one of these things that, always held, I guess, our fascination, because we consider intelligence to be something that's particularly unique about us as a species. And so we want to figure out, what is the origin for that. And so I think falling in love in AI is quite easy. I think at least that's what I thought, and, in fact, and, but the big questions and the big motivations have remained same. The methodologies have changed. And of course, the general popularity has changed quite significantly.
Right. So you do mention about the idea of human intelligence, like in terms of, like you say, these are the definitions that broadly people in AI has been always interested in. But would you say, is there a solid definition of intelligence in general that does not relate to human intelligence? Like, is it like, what is the overall idea of AI? Are we trying to mimic or reach the benchmark of human intelligence? Are we trying to beat that?
That's an excellent question. And I think some of the things that are most uniquely defining aspect of us, we don't know how to define. We don't know what it means to be human. We know when somebody is being inhuman, but we don't quite know how to define what it means to be human. We don't really quite know how to define intelligence. We don't quite know how to define consciousness and sentience, for example. These are the kinds of things that became quite big last week or 2 weeks back. Clearly we understand. It's not that we don't understand anything. There are certain aspects we can talk about. Intelligence involves the ability to think long term, reaching goals, being aware of the world around you, bending the world to your will. All of these are connected. But, I think in philosophy, they call these things cluster concepts. So there's like a bunch of things that might be needed for you to say that something is intelligent, but it's not very clear what is the full set. So I think clean definitions of intelligence have always been tricky. But typically we set benchmarks. Obviously Turing's idea was the Turing test, which unfortunately basically tells us a lot more about what we think intelligence is rather than what intelligence is. And so it's like, it's the same situation for sentience and consciousness. So seeming intelligent and seeming conscious and seeming sentient are quite different from being intelligent, being conscious, being sentient. And they are correlated, but they're not one and the same. And I think, Turing test basically was a great start, but people have found all sorts of issues with it. But now we have come back to this cluster concept idea, because intelligence is 20 million benchmarks. And the question is, what is the magic number of benchmarks that you're supposed to do so that you will be called intelligent? And this is we deal with this in life, and so we know at some level that, okay, this thing looks intelligent. But if you are pushed to actually just, provide a crisp definition, crisp, falsifiable definition, it becomes hard. So yeah, I think that has been a very interesting question. But we tend to think in terms of capabilities. And the other sad part of AI, is, in fact, I end my intro to AI class always with Marvin Minsky's quote saying, with understanding comes a sense of loss. And so it's kind of true for AI too, because something that you don't know how we do, until you figure out how we do, it looks like magical and it looks like, wow, that's what being intelligent is. Once you figure out the algorithmic foundations behind it, it might look like, oh, that's just a computer program. It's not intelligent. And so that's like a strange thing that we humans have. We tend to value ineffable, unexplainable stuff. Although civilization depended completely on explainable, codifiable things, we still like to kind of not be able to deal with concepts that we can't quite define. I joke around that if you have a boyfriend, a girlfriend, and they ask you, tell me why you love me, and if you write 10 falsifiable reasons, you're screwed. Basically, you won't have a friend. You almost have to say something ineffable about you. And, so something that cannot be falsified. So we have this romance with things that we can't define. And, that's probably part of why once you reach a capability, once you get a machine to do a capability, we lose interest in that. We no longer consider that to be intelligent. That's just commonplace. And that's, strangely enough, the part of the reason why for the longest time we focused on what we consider cognitive intelligence aspects rather than perception and manipulation, because that stuff, kids do it. Why do we care? Kids know how to recognize objects, kids know how to hold things. And first we didn't know how to do it, but secondly, we also didn't particularly care about it. We think of chess as hallmark of intelligence. We never think of holding this and carefully putting it to my mouth as a hallmark of intelligence, like at all, even though it's like one of the 20 million hallmarks of intelligence. And so so you see where we're going with this. It becomes hard to provide crisp definitions. We tend to think in terms of capabilities, and we tend to think in terms of benchmarks, and which also means you have this problem that there's always some unsatisfying aspect to this, because you would come up with some number of benchmarks. People will say, no, that's all old news, and then you'll start trying to come up with something more. But yeah.
Right. So from what I gather is basically it's hard to have a technical definition for intelligence in even in the modern day scenarios. But how do you explain, like what you also mentioned about this thing, saying like the sentient thing like got emerged in the very last few weeks. So if itself the first idea of intelligence is something that we are still struggling to define with, how does the idea of sentient, or is it just basically hype from the news media articles trying to make a point?
I think philosophers, AI is just a new kid on the block to some extent, or it's just a sort of like a potentially legitimate child of huge number of old disciplines on the block. And, ever since there were sentient beings, sentient humans, they started wondering about things like, what does it mean to be conscious? What does it mean to be intelligent, etc., etc. Again, it's hard to pinpoint and define in a black and white binary way, categorical terms, what these things are. But we do know that they are not one and the same, for example. So sentience is essentially being aware and having an inner understanding, having inner dialogue with yourself, for example, or knowing what your goals are and knowing that you are trying to do these things to reach those goals, that is different from intelligence, which is just getting there. They're not one and the same. They tend to be correlated very much. So, for example, animals are sentient. Your dog is sentient. Your dog is not as intelligent as you, but it's way more sentient than Lambda or any other, newfangled AI programs that we're talking about. It's very much aware of its world. I mean, you may not necessarily know what its inner thoughts might be, but certainly it is aware of what the world around it is. It has an understanding of its own goals, but one of the strange things is that I think you all know Noah Harari in Sapiens points this out, that there's been a great decoupling once AI started, which is up until like AI time, when computers started showing intelligence. Intelligence and consciousness came as a package. So your dog has a certain amount of intelligence, certain amount of consciousness. Your, dolphin has a certain amount of intelligence, certain amount of consciousness. You have a certain amount of intelligence, certain amount of consciousness. I mean, obviously, there are scales, but they all came as a package. There never was a thing where it's just, this is a pure intelligent thing, this is a pure sentient thing, especially intelligence. The great decoupling really is that we have now machines which are quite intelligent, but we have no clue whether or not they don't have to be sentient, and we certainly don't have any clue whether they are sentient. Okay, and I don't think we are anywhere near sentient machines. But the bigger point is looking sentient to other humans is quite different from being sentient. In fact, I think philosophers have questioned defining consciousness, and everybody agrees we are conscious, but they can't give a certificate that the other person is conscious. I know I have internal thoughts. I know I have an internal monologue. You may well be acting like you have one. I have no idea whether you actually have the same sort of consciousness that I experience, because these are subjective experiences. And so to some extent, the whole theory of mind essentially says that we have evolved to anthropomorphize everything. We basically assume that the other person has the same inner life, other entity has the same inner life as I do. It works quite mostly okay with humans, but we do this for non-humans too. I mean, there is a great psychology experiment where basically even as kids, we will see like triangles going around squares, and we start saying, oh, that triangle is chasing the square, and the square is sad that it got caught. This is complete nonsense, but that's basically what we do. We look at the world in from our own subjective experiences. We think we share, the rest of the world shares it. And so it's not at all surprising that we will consider a computer program to be sentient. My joke has been in the AI courses is that a thermos flask can be considered sentient. You pour, cold coffee in it, it keeps it cold. If you pour hot coffee in it, it keeps it hot. How does it know? It must be aware of the stuff that's being poured into it. So again, there is this aspect of simple, crisp definitions are hard, first of all. And secondly, the fact that we will consider things to be sentient, we will consider things to be human-like, is something that's in our genes. That's how we evolved. And I think we see human forms everywhere. In US, you burn a toast, suddenly people start seeing Mother Mary in the form of the thing. And in India, every possible stone I would see, people will say, can't you not see the Lord Venkateshwara's, markings on it? So we just essentially into this sort of anthropomorphization. And so the fact that we consider that people think many things are sentient is not surprising. I think it's a lot more worrisome from AI perspective not arguing about whether or not things are sentient, but to realize that even if we give a certificate saying LLM is not sentient, it doesn't stop tons and tons of people from thinking it is sentient, because they can't tell the difference between talking to a human versus talking to this program, at least in certain narrow contexts. And at that point, you can get into trouble. I mean, obviously, I think most of us are aware of the original ELIZA program that in history's first chatbot that Zoe Weizenbaum wrote, and it was like a dumb program, and it was essentially doing pattern matching and was playing a Rogerian psychoanalyst. And yet, he found that his secretary was essentially pouring her heart out to this program, and at some point of time told Joe, don't be in the room, I'm talking to this program. So basically, they wanted to have a secret dialogue with this program. And even now, people have actually found, for example, that in army, in military, when soldiers have post-traumatic stress disorder, etc., and they have found cases where they are more willing to be more forthcoming if they think they are thinking to some sort of a computer which sounds sentient than to an actual human. Because we also sort of kind of know that it sounds sentient, but we know it's not fully really the human, and we know that humans can judge us, whereas programs may not judge us. And so this whole thing becomes a strange issue of how we deal with what we consider are sentient entities. And AI people have to deal with this impact of the programs as they become increasingly more human-like, even if they don't have the same brand of consciousness, the same brand of intelligence. They are human-like. So if it quacks like a duck and looks like a duck, how long can you argue that it's not a duck? There would be enough people who think it's a duck. And that part is a more pressing issue than laughing at people saying, oh, you're stupid for thinking that this program is sentient.
Yeah, I agree. And this relates to one of the conversations I had with one of my friends who recently said that she prefers Siri over Alexa, even though Siri is much more of an inefficient, I would say, like not so great at as much as Alexa, because Siri just gets the work done. Instead, Alexa tries to make a conversation, which she does not want. So which is something like, okay, I prefer Siri because I just want my work done in the most monotonous works, like getting your volume up or playing some song or something, versus Alexa is being much more human-like, or much more like it feels like having a person around in the room. So she prefers to have Siri instead of Alexa.
I think it's basically, there's a spectrum of people. There would be people who are opposite too. And there's also this issue that after a while you want to have some peace and quiet. So, in general, when we are expecting human-like behavior from these entities, because that's how we have evolved to deal with. And when you see a stranger, we don't want them to be too chatty. And after a little while, we want them to be chatty. And after hanging around with them for years and years, if every day they are very chatty, you get sick of them. So it's like, we are almost doing the same sort of a thing with these assistants too. And, different people have different preferences in terms of the kind of dialogue that may or may not want to have. I think for every point on that spectrum, you will find people who would say, I like this kind of a interaction versus this other kind of an interaction.
Right. So based on this conversation, I want to connect two questions particularly, which one of them is related to one of your articles, which you have recently published, where saying for AI as a natural science, right? And in which one of the I'll leave those links in the description below. But in one of the paragraphs you have written, AI has been always confused between science and engineering, right? So it's basically hard to deal with like these kind of questions, right? Like nobody asks a person working database or networking these kind of questions, like are your systems having consciousness or something, which is completely related to engineering, versus AI has been questioned and debated a lot on these kind of aspects of cognitive philosophy, psychology, and all those things. So do you think to answer these questions as a person working in AI, you need to have much more of a multimodal knowledge in order to work on system. Let's say you are working on human-aware AI systems. So it requires for you to have much more knowledge than just your discrete or continuous mathematics that you said in order to develop these systems. Or I'm just downplaying the mathematics, but it requires much more idea of understanding human psychology, cognitive aspects. I think in one of your courses I took human aware AI, like you have to learn with the idea of like what I think you think versus of what you thinking, what I am thinking, like the whole three-way analogy of cognitive understanding of human brains. Is it something always a part of AI as a science? Was all of this thinking always a part of something a AI researcher has to sign up for, or is it something just that has recently popped up?
So let me unpack that. That's like a, kind of a question that sort of touches on very different things. So let me like unpack them into at least two different pieces. One is about the human aware AI, and the other is about AI systems becoming AI as a discipline becoming increasingly like a research natural science. That's what I wrote in that CSM blog. It's not a free article, it's a blog article. So let me first talk about the human aware AI part, and then I'll get to the theory of the natural science part. So in the case of human aware AI, which by the way is my current, as you mentioned at the top of the hour, my current serious interest, which is I want, my original research background was planning and decision making, long-term plans and long-term decisions. And increasingly, I'm looking at the intersection of that and human AI interaction. And my specific interest is that I don't want the humans to have to go into the land of AI systems to figure out how they are working. I mean, we have hard enough time. My way of looking at it is I have hard enough time making sense of other people around me, including you, for example. And that now if you add more things that I need to make sense of, as against they just dealing with me as if, I get to deal with them as if they're other humans, it would be too much more work for me. So to me, the human AI interaction, for it to be flexible, the AI systems essentially have to show the same kind of theory of mind that we show in our behavior with each other. So we try to have a notion of other people, ascribing other people desires, beliefs, intentions, and models of the world. And then we are trying to anticipate what they will do, provide explanations to them in terms they can understand. So, for example, if somebody asks me about a nucleus or an atomic model, depending on their background, if it's like a 2-year-old kid, my answer would be quite different from if it is like a physics graduate student, right? So I want the AI systems to do that. I want them to figure out how to interact with the human in the loop and do all the heavy lifting themselves as against humans having to do that. That's my research interest. And I agree, I think that the point you made, which is that in addition to whatever might be the, so in some sense, living by yourself as an AI entity on Mars is something we are actually, it's easier to do. I mean, Spirit and Opportunity have been roaming Mars forever, and they're pretty darn intelligent. They're like very far away from us, and they don't necessarily have to, mental model us. Increasingly, your Alexas, your Siris, and all these things are with you, and AI systems will be kind of in our day-to-day life, and I want that interactions to be fluid, and we don't have to have a different style of interaction with them than we do with humans. And to do that, they come into our world rather than we go into their world. And that brings up an entirely different set of questions, additional set of questions for AI systems, such as how do I figure out the mental models of the people I am working with? How do I provide explanations? How do I try to be explicable such that they are not surprised at what I am doing with them? How do I do collaborative problem solving? Where I say this, I are the AI systems. So that's about the human aware AI part, and that's my significant interest in research. And in fact, in the context of the more quote unquote black box style systems that we are coming up with in AI. That's not particularly surprising. I don't actually know how you think, right? I mean, I have no idea how you think, and we still talk to each other, we still cooperate, etc. The way we do this is we have this symbolic interface. I don't have a USB port to your brain. I don't need to figure out what particular neurons are firing when. We still are able to go with this abstraction of a mental model and then be able to deal with each other in the symbolic interfaces. And so we actually argue in a AAAI paper this year, a AAAI Blue Sky paper, that AI systems have to support a symbolic interface in addition to whatever other interfaces. So in addition to other multimodal interfaces, they also need to support a symbolic interface because we have evolved by this point to deal with symbolic explanations, symbolic advice, etc. They should be able to take advice from us and should give us explanations in terms that we understand rather than in terms they understand. And this is a big thing, in some parts of explainable machine learning, it's about humans trying to figure out what the machines are doing. And I think that's kind of sad. If AI is going to be here, I want my life to be easier, not more complicated, because I have more things to make sense of in their terms as against my terms. So that's on the human over AI side. The other interesting part really is, I think you're talking about the natural science part. Increasingly, so I said at the top of the hour, I guess, that I'm interested in AI because it's one of the fundamental questions. How do we get intelligent artifacts? But I'm not just interested in getting intelligent artifacts. I want to have some sense of understanding of how they work. Okay, because my joke is that if all we needed is to generate intelligent artifacts, we know how to do this in junior high. And a guy and a girl can get together and produce pretty darned intelligent artifact that will have these kinds of conversations, as that kid grows up, right? But we don't know anything more. I mean, basically, we don't take any credit for engineering our kids. We don't engineer our kids. It's kind of, there's a little bit of fun in the beginning, but then, and of course, you work with them, with the kids, and you are helping them grow up, but really you didn't engineer them. You didn't actually do the design in any sense. Engineering is all about designing. We actually design the artifact. AI could never make its mind up as to whether we are designing intelligent artifacts or whether we are just taking intelligent artifacts and trying to make sense of why they work. Neuroscience, for example, or cognitive science is later because it is thinking of humans who are already intelligent and trying to figure out why they are intelligent. AI always thought we make the things that we want. I mean, most of the history of AI has been as an engineering entity, even though it's not fully engineering. And then we were in computer science, and so people will think, wow, you guys are very presumptuous. You call yourself scientists. What is this nonsense about the science part of it? But really what is happening more recently, as you are all well aware, is we have all these massive models that are designed at almost as loose a sense as we designed our kids. Seriously, right? In the sense that, you more or less figured out how much data and what particular cloud service you're using for the GPU. And you are just as surprised as anybody else as to what that darn thing is doing. And that's what is the beauty of being parents. You're just as surprised about your kids as everybody around you, because you don't actually know how they will behave. That's why they're not engineered. But AI basically is becoming a lot more like that. We accept that this is unlike in vitro, which is basically the kids. This is in vivo, which is basically in the lab. You can make these things up, which we don't know why they work, how they work. I mean, come on. I mean, do you really believe that Google set about trying to generate a LLM that will explain jokes? They had no idea that it would do it. This is why we have, like, every day there's one more paper saying LLMs also have the following capability, possibly, because we didn't know that they would. And so what is So we are sort of becoming a research natural science. Like in neuroscience, it's a kind of a natural science because it's looking at a thing that it didn't design, trying to understand why it works. AI wasn't supposed to be that way. AI was supposed to design what and not be surprised at. I mean, any engineering discipline, nobody is surprised that the bridge I built, oh my God, I'm surprised as much as you guys that it actually stays. That's not engineering. You should be guaranteeing that the bridge stays in place. And you shouldn't be surprised that it has emergent properties that such as on Saturdays, the bridge sings and on Sundays it flies. Those are considered bad engineering, right? And AI is now basically sort of, whereas it's fine in natural science, because if you suddenly find that when nobody is looking, dolphins sing songs from Cholet, that's great. We learned something new about dolphins. You see what I'm saying? But that's what we're doing right now with LLMs, essentially. And see, massive models, as long as they become like our central, interest, in a way, we are becoming a lot more like natural science, except research natural science. Essentially, it's not a real natural science because these are not natural artifacts. We made them. We had no idea how they are supposed to work, and then we try to figure out how they work. And that's a very interesting and a different kind of research methodology. Honestly. I mean, for the longest time, AI papers would never be in Nature. Nature, the magazine, is for natural sciences. And they actually have, to me, even now, an extremely weird way of writing papers from an engineering perspective, because all the interesting details are in the appendix. And they have this nonsense thing, very short version called methods, and then, curves, right? That's basically what works in biology, because you don't prove theorems in biology. You kind of say, this is my experimental method, and this is what I observed, and make what you want of it. AI was part of computer science, and we would give theorems normally. But my point was that one part of AI has this new natural sciencey flavor. I'm not passing any judgment as to whether it's good or bad. It's just trying to understand that that's a kind of an interesting swing in the methodology. And so that was the aspect, research methodology wise, in that particular sense. I don't know if that explained something, but yeah, that's what I was trying to make sense of there.
Yeah, no, definitely explained a lot. And I think I already have 2 or 3 points that I want to have follow-ups. Is like just a bit of context for that is basically what started me into explainability of AI models was, of course, I'm coming from the other end of the spectrum where I'm much more interested into explaining the deep learning models, but for vision-based systems. So my current project with ASU and my professor and my collaborations with Mayo Clinic we are looking into post-traumatic headache patients, and it is something that has not been explained from a medical research point. Like basically people can be categorized based on their symptoms. This person is suffering from migraine, concussions, post-traumatic headache, but they don't have a clear understanding what's going on in their head that we can know, so that we can devise medicines or any kind of post treatments. And they got involved with ASU over here, and we tried to use some the basic idea of AI is to use REST nets on top of the and we got excellent results, like because the data set is big, AI is always data hungry, and the results got good enough. But now the question becomes is, how do I explain myself? Like, because the medical researchers don't want a classification, they already know that based on clinical symptoms. And that's what my focus is, trying more on, like how I can use some kind of class activation maps or something like that. But one of the reasons why I got interested in the blog article that you shared was basically I found myself in the same place, that I'm just doing some kind of post analysis on my results instead of engineering some kind of mathematical model that can explain its results. Rather than I'm just doing the post analysis that, okay, these are the probabilities of class activation maps, and how do I categorize them, how do I list all these brain regions. And that's a bit of context from my end, how why I got interested into the article. And the follow-up question to that is basically what proposition you made was designing an AI system from itself that can explain, rather than having a model that performs good and then doing some kind of aha moments that, the model is doing this and that. But would that proposition still apply to modalities that are not really explored? For example, your work mostly revolves around planning and robot actions and all those kind of collaborations. But would those symbolic AI systems still perform as good or equally good or better in cases like MRI scans or images, basically any kind of 2D image-based models? Or I'm not sure about the language models.
Yeah, please go ahead. I
No.
think my sense is actually it's not about the modality. One of the strange things about us humans is we invented language because it's too hard to deal with images. Images is a single image. And actually, the real world is I would like to call it space-time signal tube, right? I mean, if you ask me, why is this particular, you're still actually asking a very simple question. You're saying, in this particular X-ray, why do you think this X-ray shows the following disease, okay? Which is still with respect to image. In fact, there could be more interesting questions. For example, I'm no doctor, but they would sometimes look at the dynamics of the heart, okay, the way the blood is going in and out. They look at the whole thing and ask questions about that, which is sort of like asking, why did you, for example, take this flight as against this other flight? Okay, and it's like asking for explanations about your decisions. And you can't show them by just putting some little circles around a single image. You have to put annotations over some sort of a high-dimensional space-time tube. And that's extremely hard. And so my guess, of course, there's no way of proving this, but obviously my guess is we invented language because it's just too hard cognitively to talk about these space-time signal tubes. A cross-section of the space-time signal tube is an image, okay? But generally, you're talking about space-time signal tubes. So, for example, a lot of things, space-time signal tubes are like the assembly language. Everything can be thought in those terms. There's no question. But you don't think in assembly language most of the time. You think in higher level languages because it's cognitively a lot easier to think at that level than at the assembly language level. So what becomes interesting then is that you are going to humans tend to make up symbolic concepts that have denotation over these space-time signal tubes. Okay, they don't have to be just about images. They can be over a video, a sort of a space-time signal tube, as I would call it. So for example, I got an interest in basketball because my son works for basketball now. And then so they have basketball, as far as you would concern, it's not a symbolic task at all, right? It's a very physical task which you can't read books normally to how to play basketball, right? And yet we talk about basketball in symbolic terms at certain level. Like, for example, things like pick and roll. And there's actually a TED talk about this by this one guy called Second Spectrum guy, who talks about how do you recognize that a pick and roll happened in an excerpt of a basketball video. That's a symbolic concept. In fact, what that symbolic concept corresponds to many, many different videos that differ in all sorts of unnecessary, irrelevant ways. But this symbolic concept abstracts the big thing for you. And you just talk in those terms some cases. The same thing happens with doctors. They basically, when they talk to each other, they not only put pointers, they also have made up this jargon that means something to them. And so they talk in terms of those jargons, right? Doctors don't talk all the time in terms of putting circles around, and that would be like cave doctors, okay? So they talk in the medical jargon. So your explanations should be in terms of those medical jargon to the extent possible. And if you do that, you are basically doing the same symbolic interface that I was talking about in my Blue Sky paper, for example. That's the kind of thing that we have to do to work with humans. And of course, sometimes the symbols that the humans made in understanding the concept may actually be the wrong ones because they're not very good at classifying the concept right. Then you need to teach the humans, the AI system has to teach the humans new vocabulary. That's again one of the things we talk about in this Blue Sky paper, that you use the vocabulary that humans have, and sometimes you need to expand by asking humans for more vocabulary, and sometimes you need to expand humans' vocabulary because there is no simple way to explain your decision in terms they currently understand. So they need new words. A classic example for that is the AlphaGo's, the infamous 37th move, against Lee et al. Everybody knew that, oh my God, where did this come out? How did this make sense? Now, we just know that when they made that move, eventually it sort of won the game. There's a huge amount of credit blame assignment problem. We don't quite know whether or not this move is critical in making the success. But the way we normally talk to each other about why a particular move is good or bad in chess or any of these games is in symbolic terms, right? And we don't even have the right symbols for this. And so we don't give up. Instead, we expand our vocabulary. So in fact, in that case, and there's work going on, in various places, I think including DeepMind and, Bin Kim, for example, were involved in this work where they're trying to figure out what would be involved in getting this vocabulary expanded for the human. So eventually the machine needs to teach us new terms, because we would much rather think in terms of symbolic terms, honestly, than in terms of messy space-time tubes with saliency regions. Okay, it's not saliency regions anymore, it's saliency volumes, saliency hypervolumes, if you might think about it. And it's, in a way, we evolved to avoid having to deal with that. Okay, I mean, it may very well be that the accuracy is higher if you could do that, but your head is going to get very hot if you're trying to think that way. So again, we can always take the stance that, why do I need to be explainable to the doctors? We will just basically say the performance is better. There is some random experiment that is in progress where doctors are being compared to this machine in terms of the over longer term, outcomes, and the machine is doing well. So you should just trust the machine. You don't know why it is doing it, but you want to trust the machine. But, sometimes, especially in collaborative scenarios, you want to have a sense of why the system is doing it, because that's how you will start trusting the system's decisions. And I completely understand why the kind of work you're doing is extremely important. But my sense is that you would need to talk about it in terms of some symbols that doctors have. It could be multimodal explanation. Normally, when basketball is being explained, or a football is being explained on the TV, they'll put some circles, some dots, and then they're talking too. They don't, the circles and dots themselves don't explain anything. It's a talk with that explains the thing. And so all you want to really talk about is not so much that multi-model is thrown out and only symbols will be supported, but that multi-model should include symbols as one modality, because those are actually one of the biggest modalities we use. That's what we are doing right now. Essentially, we're talking, and talking is symbolic. And so that basically is my sense of why explainability has to be in terms that humans understand. I mean, people also tend to have these words, interpretability and explainability, sort of thrown around in different contexts. And I find that although there are no strict definitions, I find that it's useful to think of interpretability is with respect to human species. If some human understands it, it is interpretable. And so from the AI machine's perspective, can be a passive activity. I understand you are a bozo, you don't know what I'm doing, but somebody else understands. Like, for example, think of Rosetta Stone, which was used to, for example, decode and interpret hieroglyphics. Up until Rosetta Stone, which had like 3 languages, one under each other, we couldn't interpret hieroglyphics. We, meaning the entire human race, couldn't interpret hieroglyphics. Once Rosetta Stone happened, some linguists among us spent tons and tons of time and were able to decode it, and then they were able to interpret. So they spent a lot of time of their own. Rosetta Stone itself was just sitting there like a stone. Okay, it was not actively involved in explaining itself, right? Interpretable machine learning tends to be typically, I will do a few things and then mostly let the humans figure out what I did and while I'm doing it, maybe I use a different kind of an architecture or something, and then that might make things easier for them later. Explainability to me is with respect to a specific human or a specific small group of humans, because not all humans have the same background, right? So you give very different explanations. I mean, doctors give different explanations to, like, if you go to a doctor and they say you have a following, disease, or not, maybe not you, I'll go to a doctor and they say I have a particular disease. I'll ask, why do you think I have the disease? They'll give me an explanation in a way that they think I understand. If their colleague is passing by and they ask, why do you think Rao has this disease? They'll give a lot more involved explanation that would not be accessible to me at all, because it uses concepts that they both share, but I don't understand. Okay, so explainability is with respect to a smaller group, in general, a particular person you have in mind. Explainability is a more active role, where the explainer takes a more active role, trying to make sure that the other person understands. Interpretability, hey, if you are any good, you would have interpreted what I'm doing. If none of you are any good, then of course, I'm uninterpretable. So it's like that's something that I find that distinction makes a difference. Typically, oftentimes people kind of confused, what it may very well be that, I think in general, if you support explainability over the larger, if you know how to deal with individuals, then you can also be interpretable, in the large. But you can be interpretable in the large and not be explainable to specific groups, because they don't actually have the vocabulary, they don't have the time to spend to try to understand what you're doing. Like, for example, I can say, what Rosetta Stone did was, those people who made the Rosetta Stone, I don't even know whether they knew that we will look at the stone, but they did some part and they died, right? That's like the ultimate laziness. And the stone is sitting here, and we spent rest of the heavy lifting to figure out what is going on. In general, when we talk to each other, when I think, when I say I understand what you're doing, it should be, the question is it simple enough that I understand directly, or do I have to spend a lot of time doing background detective work to figure out what it is that you're doing? Sometimes you may want to actually not let me understand why you're doing what you're doing. That's what half of crime novels are, right? And you want to deceive people by kind of your behavior so that they don't understand the real reason why you're doing what you're doing. Your motivations might be obfuscated by your actions. But in general, if you want me to understand what you're doing, you basically help me along actively. Okay, that's what I want the AI systems to do. And that would be more about explainability, I think.
All right. So this is surely an interesting difference between the interpretability and explainability. Like, previous to this conversation, what I understood strictly in the end-to-end deep learning framework models, like how people used to differentiate between these two terms is, like, when we have linear models, linear regression or something, they are inherently interpretable. So they term these models as interpretable because the architecture inherently itself is designed in a way so that people don't need explanations. Like, you can just pull out the weights and see what features are being weighted, and it's like it's designed inherently interpretable. But when we are talking in terms of explainability, then it terms only about the post hoc process, as in the training is done, now we are at the inference stage. How do I explain this particular prediction? And like that was my understanding. I could be equally wrong.
I think that's basically, again, that's very much consistent with what I'm saying. To be interpretable, you need to know who you are trying to be interpretable with. Okay, yeah. I mean, there are people in this world. In fact, linear models are not interpretable. Talk to Cynthia Rudin, who will explain to you that I can give you a linear model with 18,000 coefficients, okay, and you have no idea what the heck it is doing. Okay, yeah. You just make assumptions. This is basically the difference between talking one-on-one. Suppose I'm trying to tutor you about a concept, or you're trying to tutor me about a concept. You try to understand my mental model and try to make sense of, try to help me make sense of what you're telling me with respect to my mental model. If, on the other hand, I'm in front of a huge audience, or you're in front of a huge audience, you have to kind of make some kind of an approximation. I'll just hope that all these people understand the following things, and then I'll just go from there, because you can't get everybody to the same specific place. Now, when you are, every talk, half the group is lost, half the group is bored. That's the usual thing, right? I mean, some people think it's just too elementary. Some people think I have no idea. that's probably the golden ratio. You won't have to be last and have to be, bored. If in fact all the people are last, then you are uninterpretable. If all the people are bored, then basically that's another different problem with the talks. So in trying to make something interpretable, you're making assumptions about the potential users. Okay, but it may very well be that the specific user you wound up having doesn't even understand linear models, and they may still want to ask questions about it, and you should be ready. If you already said, I've done this, I'm gone, I'm at home and no longer going to take any calls, this poor guy now has to figure out how to understand linear models, for example. Right? So it's a reasonable, it's a different way. I mean, that's why I said one is passive, where you did do it at the time of the beginning, assuming a certain kind of user would be using it. There is no such thing as a single type of user in the world. That's why, if in fact a single user exists, then why do I need to, like people already understand. A-star search is interpretable because humans understand it. But every time I have to explain it because the bozos that come to my class haven't yet figured that out. I mean, they're not bozos. I mean, they're like nice people who came to my class. They didn't yet figure it out. I need to explain to them. I can't just say people understand, so I don't need to explain to you. So it's, I think explanation is with respect to the person you have in front of you. When you write like a textbook, basically you assume one particular background for everybody and you just write it. And that's what is like quote unquote. And you can have bad, dense textbooks and easier textbooks and boring textbooks. It's the same way, depending on how you wind up approximating your user population. Okay. But you do this, once you do this, you don't have to be actively involved. I mean, Stuart Russell is not in my office trying to explain to me when I'm reading his textbook. He has to do that when he teaches from his textbook in the intro to AI class.
Right. And on the topic for need for explainability, and I might be citing someone like who you might already know who I'm talking about, but as in those people who are the pro advocates for deep learning have said that as in deep learning, like the end-to-end trainable deep learning models don't need explainability by inherently itself, but what we rather need is systems in place who can verify the working of these models, and we should be actively focusing on verification and like testing out these models if they can be deployed in the real world scenarios. And the examples like in terms of synonyms or analogies that you have given is basically we don't expect a radiologist to explain why he thinks I am a cancer patient, but rather what we have done in place in civilization or in the current scenarios over here is basically we have extreme tests for those person to qualify, okay, this person is definitely the one of the best radiologists, and if this person says, oh, you have a cancer or you have a some kind of ailment that is like very terminal, then you basically deal with it. You can't ask him like, hey, why do you say, like he won't be able to basically compress all the knowledge that he has learned. So they have termed this analogy synonymous to the current world of deep learning end-to-end trainable models, that we don't have to question, but rather what we have to focus is basically we have a rigorous rigorous verification process that, hey, this deep learning model is great, doing blah blah blah, and that should be good enough to be deployed in the real world scenario. What counter? I think what proposition?
So, yeah, I know who you're talking about. I believe Jan certainly said this. Jan LeCun, I mean, I like him a lot, but I think he did mention this a couple of times. But I think, like, first of all, there are two different issues. One is we don't ask for explanations for everything. Okay, I mean, my joke to Jan, I mean, I don't know if I ever told him on his face, but I certainly tweeted this, is I too don't ask for explanations for the gazillion silly recommendations that Facebook tells me. You may be interested in this page, you may be interested in this page. I don't care. I mean, most of the time I just ignore all of them. And, even if I click, I don't need, explanations for that. I deserve the right to ask for explanations when somebody says, Rao, you have 3 hours to live. How exactly did you come up with this decision? I mean, you might just say, Rao, you should just believe me because I am the world famous doctor, etc. I think we can get by without explanations, but it's an unsatisfactory way, because if we didn't have to explain, then why did we invent language? If we just had to do things and all that mattered is competence, for example, then much of human interaction is explainability. I actually completely question the radiologist analogy, because there is such a thing called bedside manners, and medical schools go out of their way to teach doctors the importance of bedside manners in addition to the content. Okay, because if the patient doesn't feel comfortable and doesn't think that the doctor would like to explain to them, they would not follow what the doctor is doing. And in fact, the outcomes of the medical practice would be much worse. Bedside manners is like the most fashionable thing to talk about in medicine, right? Nobody ever says, it is in fact true, unfortunately. And I actually have personal experience of this. I mean, when my dad once had open heart surgery in Kaiser Permanente in LA, and so we had to figure out which doctor to go with. And it turned out that the doctor that we went with actually was all competence, no human factors. Okay, the doctor we went with was actually highly competent, but oh my God, I remember when after everything was over, he came out of the hospital room and the operating theater, and then we said, go. He said, yeah, it went fine. There were like more things that were wrong, so we had to cut off more things. Any questions? This is what he said. Okay, so if we did not have multiple different ways of establishing his performance, and at least through transitive trust, like such as my sister actually works in Kaiser, she looked at all these outcomes, etc., and they said, despite this guy's very bad human factors, he's actually good at what he does. Why that particularly in that case actually sort of tells me that yes, performance can sometimes overcome the explainability. In fact, sometimes people are good at there are lots and lots of doctors who have very good bedside manners, but are pretty lousy doctors in actual practice. But if you were to go, you're more likely to fall for the doctor with the better bedside manners. Why do you think humans would be different in the way they're going to use, AI systems? Because we are what we are, essentially. I agree that third-party trust is a good way, and standardization is a good way. There are certain things that I don't ask, such as why exactly do you think today the plane won't fall off? I don't ask that to the pilot. But there are also many things for which that directly impact me, and not just anybody else but me. I would like to know, why are you doing this? And it may not be all that simple. So in fact, it's both true that we want explanations, and also true that if we work with each other for long enough time, we could coordinate without words. We in fact actually consider, like for example, we consider, like ballet dancers, right? They don't get to talk to each other in the middle saying, now I'm about to fall into your hands, now be ready, etc. But for God's sake, they did talk when they were practicing, so that they actually knew, they have developed all this tacit symbology, etc., so that things will go fine, etc. But in the beginning, at least, we would expect explanations. And the general idea is explanations would become less important as we continue to trust the people in the loop. And saying you should trust because somebody gave like a particular rating is not always going to work. And also there may not be such ratings for everything. Okay, right. So it's one of these things. I mean, why did we look for explanations? I mean, even as we were talking about the fact that we don't ask for explanation all the time, we also say that we are asking for explanation lots of times. So why are we doing this? I mean, we've been around with each other longer than we've been around with any of these AI systems. We still ask each other explanations, oftentimes post-hoc explanations. Why do we do that? And are we just going to say that humans are stupid, they should start being smarter now that the AI systems are there around them? And if you do, then I would say that's the kind of problem I want to avoid. I don't want me to change because AI came around. I want the AI to change because it's living with me. Do you see what I'm saying? So because that's what I'm creating the damn thing. Well, we're not at least designing it, but at least we're creating it, we're training it or whatever. So we should be able to make sure that it would give explanations when asked. I'm not going to ask for explanation all the time. It is very much true that sometimes people don't want explanations. After a while, they may not want, they want to switch off the explanations. But, just because you don't need like a, flame, like a flame retardant all the time, you don't throw away your flame retardant from the room. It might be needed sometimes. And in fact, explanations are needed more often, than just once in 15 years or something. It's true that they're not always needed. They're not always needed in every task. They're particularly not needed in the very simplistic tasks, such as, you might be interested in this page. I don't care. I mean, I have no stake in it. I mean, if I ignore you, I ignore you. It doesn't matter. If on the other hand, you say, Rao, you should make your portfolio in this way, your stock portfolio in this way, so that you can retire easily, then I'll say, what's the explanation? And the fact that your explanation may not necessarily completely make sense to me is beside the point. Because sometimes part of giving good explanations is for the advisor to figure out what is the level at which I can understand and get me to the right level. That's what I was arguing AI systems have to do with humans too. They need to establish a symbolic interface and explain in terms that I understand, and then either increase their vocabulary or increase my vocabulary as needed. That should be the way to go, rather than just say, since we can't do explanations, we'll just make lemonade with lemons and just say nobody wants them. I'm not saying capability is unimportant. Capabilities is very much important. And in fact, by the way, entire jurisprudence is about explanations. I mean, imagine I give you like a judge who is actually a computer judge who is better than human judges, right? They'll just give the answer. You're not going to deal with it. I mean, in fact, yesterday, Roe v. Wade was thrown out, day before yesterday, and they all wrote big tons of explanation of their reasoning. Why? Because it's important, because we expect the explanations to be present in many cases. Jurisprudence is completely about explanations, for example. And because one of the other things about explanations is contestability. If you tell me that the reason I did this decision is, even with the post hoc, you give me a explanation, then I can say, well, what if I falsify this part of the explanation? Would you have still done this decision? And that way, I have a way of being part of. That's how I slowly increase my trust in you. In fact, we have work going on in our lab, which basically shows that AI systems can start by being explicable and providing explanations. But as time goes on, as the human's trust increases, there would be less need for that. And in fact, that not only actually reduces the need for explanations, that might also give more freedom to the AI system. In general, I mean, you know this. I mean, if you have a boss who is looking over your shoulder all the time, basically, you want to make sure that they trust you enough that they'll go away. So during the time when they're looking over your shoulder, you do things that are explainable, right? And then when they go away, then you can, have some fun. But as long as you're still keeping the performance, saying that off the bat, right, straight off the bat, you should just trust me and not ever monitor me. That's not the way we work.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I love that thing, and I related with one of the very recent experiences I had. Like, I attended this very nice American Headache Society conference very recently, just 2 weeks back, and I was talking to one of the PIs who is on my project, and I talked to him, and he has been in the medical research for like almost more than I have been alive on this planet. So definitely, he has seen a lot of stuff. And one thing he mentioned was like, there are no AI models. Like, for example, we see AI being deployed in very good tech industries like Netflix, Facebook, and whatnot, but there has been no single AI device ever been deployed in medical research. And I have been personally, I have been always overloaded with papers that are being published in medical research. Like I feel like, okay, I feel like this field is already saturated. But when it comes to real world scenarios, like there are no medical institutions, like there could be a small research institute in Stanford who is like trying to do some kind of trials and using AI for screening or any kind of diagnosis, but there has been no AI based system. So this, like, I definitely understand your point over here. Is like when it comes to high stake decisions, like AI is still not, and like at least the end-to-end trainable deep learning models are definitely
I mean,
hard
it doesn't. I don't know that. First of all, I don't necessarily equate any specific methodology with the goals of AI. There's at different times there are different things that are particularly effective. Certainly, there's no question that deep learning has been amazingly effective on a certain kinds of tasks. Task knowledge tasks with tons and tons of training data. They have been quite effective. There's no question about that. But this idea that that machine knows best, like father knows best, is not going to work, because for many cases, for both performance and ethical reasons, you want humans to be part of the loop. Okay, for example, like in medical applications, it's going to be quite a long time before you can remove humans completely from the loop. So the best way to actually deploy medical systems, AI in medicine, is to make them assistive to the humans in the loop. So this is AI as intelligence augmentation rather than artificial intelligence that I don't need the humans. Okay. If you have humans in the loop, they are not just going to say, yeah, my system says so, I will say so. Because they know that because you have a medical doctor in front of you, you will ask for explanations. And they might need why the system told them this particular answer. So sometimes it's very easy to interpret, in which case they can develop an explanation for somebody else's decision, which is the AI system's decision. More often, they would like the AI systems to provide some help in providing the reasons as to why it reached the decision. And that would be even more important for basically human in the loop. And collaborative problem solving typically has humans in the loop. I think my general sense is, if all we wanted is give Earth to AI and we go off to some other planet like in Valley or something, with our DALL-Es, we don't need explanations. We will talk to each other, in like as in that Valley, the movie, we'll all be nice and fat, sitting on like, chairs and talking to each other, and the Earth is basically taken over by AI or something. That is fine. They don't need to talk. I mean, there's no humans to talk to, so there's no question. But if you want a future where we want to get along, right, then remember that our human society is already full of division of labor. We have experts for things. We don't always completely dismiss them, but we still ask for explanations. Why have we evolved such that even though the doctor knows better than you still ask questions to the doctor? Even though the lawyer knows better than you about the law, you still ask questions to the lawyer.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's the way we, engender trust. I mean, that's the way to engender trust in people. So the fact that other people trust is useful, but sometimes you may still need your own way to increase your trust in this thing. So my sense is, as long as AI systems are going to be in human in the loop scenarios, you will need explanations.
Yeah, definitely. But let me zoom out to a particular question that focuses much more on you as a researcher. Like, what motivates you personally? Like, when you try to work on a project that is solving some kind of problem, you end up publishing those results in conference, or you end up taking that project. What motivates you? Is it something, the idea of the application, or what is the end product? I won't say product, but it is the end thing that you're building. Does that motivate you on what it is solving versus the theoretical concepts that you...
Yeah, I think it's a lot more, I don't know, it's not as much about theory versus application. It's more about, I understand one epsilon aspect of how to get computer systems to provide intelligent behavior in some slither of the universe, right? So, and again, that's why I'm not as satisfied generally if I just have the artifact and I don't know why the artifact works. Even if I train it, I need to be able to have a sense of why that makes sense. And so that's the thing. And I know as to why I should be interested in intelligence, as I said, I think it's very hard not to be interested in, intelligence, because it's one of the three foundational questions, the way I see it. So that's why the bigger reason is that that's like, very interesting stuff. And the thing that motivates is that I have now figured out how to do some aspect of intelligent behavior. So of late, mostly it's about some aspect of collaborative intelligent behavior between humans and machines. So they are now able to provide explanations. They're now able to provide customized explanations. They are now able to provide explanations, even though vocabularies between the humans and machines are different. The machine is still able to make explanations that humans can understand. And similarly, they are now able to work with each other by, just as you and I work by, sort of mental modeling and anticipating what the other person will do. Machines can do that, and I'm supporting that in some scenarios. So that's the kind of thing that sort of more motivating. And of course, really the huge motivation for me is working with students. So I think, I talk sort of about ideas, and then I also am lucky enough to have very smart students who would basically do a lot more of running with the ideas. And so that's just, it's like a beautiful way. I have like multiple minds because of my students. That helps quite a bit. So that also motivates quite a bit. So I think I'm one of these people who would be bored to death. I think Feynman once said, Richard Feynman once said, at the risk of, dropping a great man's name, that he was so happy that he was not working in a lab and that he was a teacher, that he was in Cornell, because research is such that sometimes you don't have any great ideas. And, in a lab, you just give like a whiteboard and a desk and say, yeah, do research, 15 units of research per day. It can depress the heck out of some people. And I would be one of them. To me, it's one of the beauties of being in the university is I'm doing that. I'm also teaching, I'm interacting with students. So I have like this way of having additional minds, that I have partial claims on, and they're good minds. And so that helps. So that motivates quite a bit. Even again, it's not, life, we wind up in, humans are very different from machines, right? We basically care about all sorts of intangibles. Why do I wake up and come to the lab? It's not always, oh my God, I'm just going to prove this theorem. Actually, that's very few times. It's a lot more, I get to talk to the students. I get to, have conversation. My lab is right outside the door. And normally I'm just standing there, talking to them, spontaneously. And that is a huge motivation. And sometimes ideas come from that. And so that's sort of my thing. But in addition to the fact that, all of this is, I kind of think that I basically can't think of research without teaching aspect. So that, to me, for me personally, that's very important.
Yeah. I was just talking to my professor yesterday. She was awake till late night, and I was talking to her, and this was the idea. Like when I joined ASU in 2018 for my masters, I always wondered what is the motivation factor for professors to stay in the faculty domain for so many long years, right? Like the industry paycheck difference is definitely bigger in computer science. So what makes them stay in one place for so long, teach the same course again and again, grade assignments, and have the same loop of students coming and go asking the same questions? What is the motivation factor for them? And definitely research is one of them, but what keeps them at one place? And now after my so far experience, again, still I'm still a very newbie in this field, but my so far experience at Amazon, and I'm hope people at Amazon are not watching this one, but it's basically I'm much more inclined towards academia after my experience at Amazon. And I understand what is the driving factor. The research is much more pure. You get much more, I would say, authority, or at least the freedom to explore different options and different ideas, rather than having a product set in mind and having an end goal that, okay, this is what we want to work on.
Yeah, that's actually a very good point. And in fact, there was this whole hoopla about various companies firing their ethics groups, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And then everybody getting all mad at these companies saying they are infringing on the academic freedoms. Wake up. Academic freedoms don't hold outside of academia.
Yeah.
Companies ultimately, they I mean, it's great that great research is being done in companies. I don't belittle that at all, but you have to know what you're signing up for. I mean, and there are different ways. I mean, everybody, I think to me, one of the biggest things is everybody has a different reward metric. I mean, I just told you my reward metric. I'm not saying that should be the reward metric for everybody. I just mentioned Feynman because he happened to have that kind of reward metric, has obviously much better capabilities, but that sort of a reward metric, that's what got me using. Some other people would rather not look at students and would rather just work on applications that they know people are using, and that's their reward metric. If you want that, you should be in industry, for example, but don't go to industry expecting full academic freedoms and complain that when you don't have it, because academic freedoms are in academia. That's the prefix of the academic freedoms. And similarly, don't expect to hang around in the university and have the same kind of deployment potential that industries can have, right? I mean, because I ultimately have to think about my students' thesis, not about whether I can farm them into some kind of a company, right? And so it's a very different way of looking at research, and so it's great that a lot of actually, I should mention this too, that one of the interesting things that's going on in AI is that we do have these companies doing very good research groups, and in fact there are all sorts of interesting methodological things going on in terms of certain types of research is so resource intensive that it oftentimes is beyond the resources of the universities. I mean, like every run of every time you're training GPT-3, at that time it was taking $5 million or something, right? So it's a very different kind of a thing. And so back just before the pandemic got over, pandemic started, AAAI was held in New York, and we had this funny AAAI debate resolved that research really should be done in the industries, and university should give up. And I was supposed to argue for the university position. You can actually look it up on the YouTube. It was quite well received. But my point is that there's always a long term and a short term. Okay, research is also exploration, exploitation. At every level of life, there is exploration and exploitation, and somebody has to be doing explorations. I think in a companies, I think there are more niches in the companies now that there are more exploration going on than before, especially the massive companies like Google's of the world. But in the end, and that's I had this very funny, strange opening statement. That's what I was basically pulling the leg of Eric Harwich, who was sitting on the side, because he was from Microsoft Research, for example, that in the end you don't expect that. The industries have to think of the bottom line. Universities have a different metric. It's just, and you can't argue against the metric. And so in fact, and if you're always in the exploitation phase, my joke is, back in late 80s, when expert systems were all the rage, you would have Jeff Hinton and Yuda Pearl working on faster rule matching systems. That would be useless, right? Because it was good that they weren't working on that. There were tons and tons of people who are working on faster rule matching systems at the time of expert systems. But there were few people, in random places in academia who were doing completely different things. And it wound up being useful way much later. So because universities have a longer horizon, they can afford to have a longer horizon. If I'm a shareholder company, I can't, right? Because shareholders will just take my stock down to zero, if basically I'm only doing long term and not thinking about what's going to be happening right away. And so you need both, but certainly I completely expect that the huge, big ideas are likely to still come in from academia. Because first of all, I think even if in fact LLMs wind up being the only way, which I don't at all believe, there would be, in fact, I think we will wind up finding ways in which they can be trained. You can try work with them from academia too. And the fact that you don't necessarily have a short-term bottom line helps these things. But I'm not saying companies shouldn't exist. I mean, if everybody's only thinking about long term, then there is no cell phones, there is no DALL-E system, etc. right away. These guys have the resources to actually make them usable, etc. It's great, I think. But I think it's just really a question of different people have different reward metrics, and I'm happy that there are people who find academia interesting, because that's been very helpful for human race, at least as of now, until now. So.
And I wanted to know, like, I think I saw a few of your tweets regarding DALL-E as a model. Like, is there something you would like have to, like, have you had the chance to work with, like, sorry, not work with, but as in try out the DALL-E model? Like, what do you
I
think?
have DALL-E now, yeah, and they just sent it to me, and I'm playing with it. But yeah, it's great, and I mean, I think, look, it's very impressive, but we have no idea how they work. I mean, it's like, so I think there are two very different things. As I said, DALL-E is like suddenly finding that your kid is so smart that it can start doing somersaults. He or she can start doing somersaults like at 6 months old. We didn't expect it. Wow, that's amazing. But hey, did I do it? No, of course not. I mean, it's like this. I actually find the whole seminal work, if you look at the etymological basis, it's like laughable. We barely do anything. We have a bunch of fun, and then kids just come out, and we don't get to take any credit essentially for the capabilities. The same thing with DALL-E right now. There are certain things we can do. I mean, obviously, there are certain things we can do for kids too, increasingly, because we know genetic basis of life. We basically are already at a place where we can either diagnose before, if the kids are likely to have very bad genetic conditions, and help before they come out, for example. The same thing we can do with DALL-E. We can train it in different ways. For a DALL-E, you have Imagen, you have Party. There are different approaches. It's great, amazing stuff. Very nice that this is happening. But I think eventually we'll also have to try to get some sense as to how they are working. But I don't have very high hope at the level of tacit tasks. I mean, DALL-E is doing essentially poster child tacit knowledge task, which is thinking up an image. And we do it, but we have no clue why we do it, how we do it. And so I think we basically, in fact, I think my point in that Polanyi thing that you mentioned earlier is that we've been pretty bad in dealing with tacit knowledge tasks by programming computers to do them, because we don't know how we do them. Okay. But just as we don't know how we do computer vision, and so we are much better off training systems with just examples, because there's no other game in town. Similarly, if you are doing NASA mission planning, there are no deep learning systems doing NASA mission planning, thank goodness, because there are not that many examples, right? I mean, and so there is actual domain knowledge, and there are actual human preferences, and it's actually possible to provide quite a significant symbolic model. And so, in fact, my argument is that in the case of, where human symbolic knowledge is not easily available, there's no point in pestering them to give it, because they would just give you gobbledygook. In the cases where they have it, saying, don't tell me, I'm just going to learn it from data, is also dumb, because many cases there's not enough data. It's nothing about end to end. It's really a question of how much data is available. And there are certain things that we can do that we happen to know already. We have a much better understanding of how the plan should, what sort of, for example, effects and preconditions certain kinds of actions might have. And if somebody is trying to give it to you, even if they're not completely correct, how do you use it? So, for example, this ICML, we have a paper which talks about how a deep reinforcement learning system can take an approximate symbolic model and do better than that. I know it's different from ignoring. So all I'm saying is, don't just say, I don't want to hear what you have to say. I will tell you what I want to do, and you tell me whether I'm right or wrong. That's sort of a dumb idea when people actually are ready to give constraints and preferences. And in general alignment, when you're telling me what you want, and I say, no, I don't want to hear you, I want to figure out what you want, without talking to you, what's the advantage? In certain cases, you don't know what you want. I completely understand. I mean, but certain cases, we actually don't really understand our own desires, for example. But in many cases, we have very strong understanding of what is right versus wrong. And, this whole entire bias worries was because basically the systems are just going from the data that actually exists. And we all have this other level at which we know there are certain things that even if we think it, we are not allowed to say it. I don't think people don't think biased thoughts. I don't think people are pure of mind. That's not what people are. But we learned that to be civilized, you need to kind of filter.
Yeah.
Right? And the filtering is actually mostly symbolic filters, oftentimes. And why would you not want to use that knowledge instead trying to say, I will do something and you tell me whether I'm right or wrong? Because that would be a much longer and more painful way to train. And so I think that is a way of looking at, how to get by, with but coming back to DALL-E, I mean, I think what currently DALL-E and LLMs are doing are essentially more at the tacit level tasks. The symbolic tasks, especially the planning tasks, etc., they are not at all good. In fact, we have this paper, a benchmark out saying that LLMs just do very bad planning, which is not surprising, which should not be surprising, but for the fact that people are thinking LLMs can do everything. Okay, they're not designed for that. They're designed to complete the next word. They just happen to be sort of doing all sorts of random additional things because we have much less stringent expectations of the machines. Okay. Whereas for plans, there is no such thing as the plan looks good. If it doesn't work, it's not a plan. And it's a more stringent, and especially if you have like a longer term thing, getting the grammar is something that machines can do well because grammar is shared by like all of the language. Getting the correctness is a lot more problem specific. And there may not be enough data. So you may not have figured that out. And it's a conditional behavior. And doing it almost oftentimes requires learning the world models. And for that, for example, things like Gatto are trying to use LLMs to do that, but they're currently extremely sample inefficient because essentially most worlds are non-ergodic. That means if you do the wrong action, you die. And you're somehow assuming that somebody gave you faithful simulators. And where are these people who are writing these simulators? And they are humans. And they're writing simulators, oftentimes they actually could tell you that in some logical form too, some sort of a symbolic form too. And you're just saying simulator is okay, symbolic form is bad. You're taking human knowledge. It's just you push it under the rug and say there is a simulator available. The day when Gatto works in the world, real world, once in a while it gets run over by the bus and still reaches human level intelligence, even at a primitive level, then let's talk about it. So my sense is that I think these are great, exciting days to live in, but there are also obvious challenges that it's not just increasing the number of parameters, increasing the scale. It's actually interacting with the world and dealing with the fact that you don't necessarily have the kind of samples that we have gotten used to, the number of samples that we've gotten used to in the up until now deep learning. And the way we get by with much fewer samples is obviously because we have somehow evolved with much better architectures. I have no idea how we did that, but some people are hoping that if I keep doing this, then maybe LLMs will get a better architectures too, but that completely remains to be seen.
Yeah, I mean, one of the only best case scenario of what I have seen, one of the creators mentioned is like the best case scenario for use case of DALL-E is basically people who are in the creative content creation domain. They can just have a quick proof of concept saying like, if I want to just create an image of, let's say, Simpson sitting in a BMW, what does it look like when I want to create a cartoon or something like that, out of it? It could be just a quick way of proof of concept, and then definitely it's not the best of the quality. Like you cannot publish those in your comments.
I completely agree with that. In fact, I have a piece, another blog piece on imitation games and large language models and CSAM, and that basically makes the exact argument that it's amazing technology. As to be used in what I would call computer-supported cooperative work, CSCW, computer-supported cooperative work. It's just, I basically the other day after the Roe v. Wade, I happened to be essentially very sad that Roe v. Wade was demolished. And so I was feeling sad. And then I basically was asking DALL-E this what I thought was reasonably involved prompts, like an American woman forlorn at her forced regress to the Republic of Gilead, which is basically a reference to The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. And it came up with very nice, reasonable looking pictures. I'm very bad at drawing pictures. So I could look at those pictures. That gave me some solace. I actually tweeted that out. And in fact, I think with the humans in the loop, it's a very different issue. And I'm very impressed with the technology. Make no mistake about it, because we had no idea. I think I did this interview with somebody the other day. I was also saying, yeah, you can talk about all sorts of problems that will happen because DALL-E exists, but every technology has downsides. You do have to take a minute to be completely impressed at the fact that until last year, we didn't even think this was possible in the next decade. Forget about this year. Okay.
Yeah.
And we don't know how it works, but it seems to be working right now at some level. And as symbolic, as human in the loop, in general, once there's human in the loop, a computer-supported cooperative work, sweet spots are completely different. I used to teach this information retrieval course long back, and I used to make this thing that, remember, Google made its name with bag of words model. Language as bag of words. Okay, so for example, you have seen these magnet games, there's the kitchen magnets, the bunch of magnetic words on the kitchen refrigerator, and you can rearrange them to make very interesting messages, etc. A bag of word model considers all those messages to be identical because they have the same exact bag of words. Okay. And so it obviously loses entire swaths of nuance in language. But it was good enough to actually make search engines work, that they could give us pretty reasonable, relevant results in computer-supported cooperative work, because you provide me suggestions, I check whether or not they're reasonable. Okay, and of course, if bag of words can be helpful, LLMs and BERT, which is running Google right now, is of course a lot more helpful, which is very different from computer-supported cooperative work thing is different from making them autonomous. They'll just do everything. We don't even need to be in the loop. That is a very different issue, because people both sides are to be blamed. The companies don't make a strong enough point that we are essentially only keeping them in the computer-supported cooperative work scenarios. And the general public tends to look at everything and say, oh my God, the things are going to get us. Because you would see the downside more right away, before the upside. And, it's not that the downside isn't there, but the upside has improved quite significantly, and it can be used quite well in computer-supported cooperative work. And, I actually was just saying yesterday that, in a way, the fact that these systems are available for everybody to use, you could see that as a bad thing. Everybody was very worried, for example, that Alexa now can do voice cloning and talk in your grandfather's voice or something. That was like the day before yesterday's controversy of the day. My view is voice cloning technology has been around for 4 years now. People are already using it. There was this famous saying that the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. Okay, and that's the way the world has always been. The future was always there, but it will slowly reach everybody. Some other people will have access to the future before the rest of us do. I would think one of the good things that's happening right now is all of us are getting faster access to the future. And it's kind of patronizing to say that only some people know how to use future and others don't. You could take actually offense at it. And in fact, people knowing that voice cloning is so easy might make them a lot more circumspect in terms of what they trust and what they don't trust. Saying that if they didn't know, because of this, they would basically be downsides. Well, there were downsides before. You think people weren't using voice cloning? People were actually calling, the people who wanted to use this arbitrage to exploit the arbitrage and make money were doing it. The moment the jig is out, everybody knows it, people will no longer be as easily believing their ears. And that would actually be good, I would think, because it essentially sort of, there is an argument to be made that, getting future more widely distributed faster is not a bad thing, right? And I think that is something that is happening right now. And I think, it's obviously when you first see this, people will see the downsides. I think it's very important to be vigilant. It's very important to figure out how to control that. But saying that you should just keep it under lock and key, it doesn't make sense, because somebody else has it. First of all, the moment DALL-E came out, DALL-E Mini came out. DALL-E guys would not still let you have Obama kissing Trump. DALL-E Mini probably will. I haven't tried it, but it probably will. And certainly if DALL-E Mini can do it, somebody else sitting in some other country can make a version which will allow you to make Obama kiss Trump and all sorts of other things. Because once the capability is out, it can be done. There's no huge moat. It's not like nuclear bombs where uranium and processed uranium is a pretty big moat. Not everybody has access to it.
Yeah,
here is just GPUs and easily available. There's not that much brains involved, in this, right? So anybody can train it. Once somebody finds it seems to be working, the gold rush mentality. If somebody finds there's gold there you'll run and you also get the gold. And saying that in such cases, we should keep things under lock and key isn't going to help, because it will come out anyway.
Yeah, I think AI, just like any other tool, has its pros and cons. And I think it's better to focus more efforts on understanding the cons of it and working more, like having systems in place that can prevent the cons from spreading it, rather than keeping it in, like you said, like on locked doors.
I agree. I think it is reasonable to spend more time understanding before doing it. And one can argue that people try to do that. Like, for example, that's the problem, right? It's like there's no way of winning this game, because when OpenAI, for example, put out GPT-3 and said, we won't give it out right away, everybody yelled at it. And then if they give it out, everybody yells at them saying, why are you giving it out? So it's either way, you can't necessarily win, because we are all trying to figure out, it's not that anybody is wrong here, but certainly I'm slightly more encouraged by the fact that, for example, especially, OpenAI, has these policy teams. One of the big guys, Miles Brundage, was actually our student. He was in my AI class many years back. He's like the head of the policy right now there. And they have, they've been basically serious about studying to some extent what are the downsides of the technologies that they're putting out. And I think, and then putting it out, which is, a reasonable way. But even there, I know that if OpenAI might be, once the genie is out of the bottle, it's hard to put it back. Yeah. And so we do need to figure out quickly how to mitigate the downsides. And I think we may buy some time. That's what basically, OpenAI was doing. But the moment people, it's many of these things, really, I think somebody said this once too, that many of these things, it's not like, the difficulty is not like proof of Fermat's last theorem, where it's a huge, long chain of complicated concepts being put together, where pieces were brought by different people, etc., etc. It was just us not believing that this might work, because this was almost like saying infinite monkeys typing at the typewriters might produce Shakespeare. Yeah, that's true, but why are we going to waste time on it? But it turns out that sometimes it might actually be, if you don't mind, putting that amount of compute and the examples at the thing, it is actually feasible. The reality is that I don't think OpenAI believe it is. They are just as surprised as anybody about what happened in the LLM world. And I think, I'm certainly sure that the language is already more grammatical. Obviously, there's like one of the things nobody takes a minute to be impressed at is LLMs never produce an ungrammatical sentence, like never. Okay, we are only worrying about the fact that they're not coherent because they only look at a small window. That's impressive. How did they figure out? The way we figured out, basically we also, grammar is something that, native speakers, especially, you and I, I'm sure, you learned a different language than English. I learned Telugu before English. I actually don't understand Telugu grammar. I just know it, because I've basically learned Telugu without having to understand the grammar. English was somewhat different because at least the way it was taught in India, for example, when I was growing up, they would teach all these grammatical rules, and that will sort of tongue tie you most of the time because you don't want to speak because you may be grammatically wrong. And actually, it's actually a bad idea sometimes. But second language tends to be, more like that. LLMs are essentially figuring out grammar without being told grammar, right? And that is something that we didn't expect will happen. And there should be some reason to be impressed. So my thing is this Buddhist middle ground. I'm sort of not particularly impressed with people saying, oh my God, something else will not be done. And also the triumphalist people saying everything is done. I think we are at a certain point. I certainly know that certain capabilities are much harder. For example, long-term, long horizon planning in real-world tasks is very hard yet for any of these technologies. There may be different technologies. And deep reinforcement learning, for example, is extremely sample inefficient. And right now, people are using LLMs for doing some primitive-ish planning, and we just showed that that's like pretty darn bad most of the time. So there are things that, pretty significant hurdles, but certainly we didn't expect to be here, even a few months back. I think that's pretty nice.
Yeah, I mean, I love this conversation, but let me take a step back. And you mentioned about something like students motivate you, and the idea of having different minds is a good thing for your overall research domain. But what you have been professor for a long term, and you have seen industries doing research. You have seen academic like you have served in different as chairs, as reviewers, and lots of professional duties you have done. What would you say accounts for a good PhD thesis for any student, any person who is doing any kind of research? What accounts for a good research thesis, be it a master student, be it a PhD student? And basically, what advice would you give for PhD students trying to figure out what to work on? Because I'll just take one sentence for the context. Is basically, in computer science, it's typically hard to figure out a problem, which I see. In other disciplines, I think, as you mentioned, like natural sciences, we are trying to observe things, we are trying to find some kind of patterns and publish results. But versus computer science, we have to stick with a problem and try to find out a problem to work on, and then we start the process of research. So yeah, I'll leave it up to you to answer these two questions.
I mean, first of all, I don't think there's a pat answer to this. I mean, I was just, my way of, I keep telling my students that at a certain level, I mean, my analogy would be that undergraduate degrees are sort of, somebody else puts constraints on you. You must do the following courses, and when you're done, you're done. Okay, there's a structure and constraints that somebody else puts. Doing undergraduate degree, passing undergraduate degree is hard enough because not everybody passes all the courses. Okay, but it's like basically, it's hard enough to pass undergraduate degree, but there's only so much of a variance. I mean, like a 0.0 GPA, 4.0 GPA. That's the variance in the undergraduate degree. Okay. PhD, on the other hand, is the limit essentially is very high. Up limit is very high. Low limit is also surprisingly low. Actually, it's easier to do a bad PhD than a mediocre undergraduate degree. It's not, you should not be surprising, because the point is undergraduate degree is all about imperatives. You must do this, this, and this. Until then, you don't even get to ask for a degree. PhD, increasingly, I mean, it's always been that way, but if you remove things like qualifiers, etc., there are no imperatives. And most universities have already given up on qualifiers because you want actually good PhD students to consider doing PhD. So why put hurdles in their way? So then the question is, unless you make up some arbitrary things like thou shalt have K papers in conferences or something, where the papers and the conferences have different quality metrics, etc. It really is, it's a bunch of options with costs and benefits. You can pick very hard problems, and you may not be able to, if you win, you'll get a huge payoff. And if you lose, you essentially don't have any papers to show. But actually, in many cases, honestly, people are in STEM disciplines. I don't know of anybody who actually fails PhD defense. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Nobody fails PhD defense. You more or less might decide, I haven't done good enough work. I don't feel like even standing up in front of people. You might leave. But if you actually stand up and you say, this is the hard problem I tried to work on, this is the things I tried, they didn't work, you'll get your PhD. It's true that you may not be remembered because you mostly got negative rather than positive results. But negative results are sometimes good too, especially if they're good negative results. But my thing is that I think people tend to overthink it. I certainly overthought it. I spent a lot of time as a PhD student looking for the world's best proposal topic rather than doing the best research. And my general sense is keep a bigger goal, but keep yourself busy with incremental steps towards that. And don't be too worried about doing other things that are not directly on what you think is the path to your whatever is the bigger question you're trying to answer. Because if you're thinking, that's just the way it is. If you're thinking about one problem, normally, I actually, one of the biggest suggestions I have with students when they try to get into PhD or try to do research with me is the absolute time matters more than the amount of it you spent on the research. So for example, if you're only going to spend 1 full month on the thesis, spreading that full month over 1 year is way better than doing it in 1 month. Because if you just, I need to get done within 1 month, you'll just sit there and say, I need to get done. Nothing happens, right?
Yeah.
Because it's not like, it's like a bunch of busy work to be completed. As you said, half of PhD is learning how to ask the right questions. And then that is an art form. We don't necessarily have a simple answer to that. And different disciplines are different. Like in biology, etc., there's this idea that PhD is just a journeyman's thing. Somebody else tells you, do this following experiment, and it's only in the postdoc that you will get little more independence. And then as professors, you get a lot more independence. And then people keep falling all through the way. Like in biology, sometimes people do like 4 or 5 postdocs before they become faculty members or research scientists somewhere. In STEM fields, especially in computer science, that's not been that way because we have red hot market. Basically, people are ready to hire people. So essentially, it's like the big issue is getting a PhD versus getting a PhD where you also learned the art of asking the right questions. And that's a much more difficult thing. And time actually matters, spreading, because you get good ideas exactly when you want to sit on the beach and not think about research. When you think, at least for me, when I want to think about research, I may not get ideas. Whereas if I'm doing something else, then the mind goes where it goes and you might get good ideas. And since sitting for 1 month in front of the computer saying, come on, paper, come on, it's not going to work. It's just a waste of your time. So I basically almost never, for people come to me asking for MS thesis work, etc. Normally, they're supposed to do it in the last 1 year. So they come in the last 1 year or maybe even 6 months. In theory, it's not hard. If somebody else has exactly figured out what you need to do and you do busy work for 6 months, that's not a bad thesis. But most of the time, if you want to ask the right question, if you want to understand the art of research, you need to spend that over a longer period of time. And so that's the thing for PhD too. And it's realizing that a bad PhD is easier than a bad undergraduate degree, but a good PhD is much harder than the best undergraduate degree. Because there's no limit as to how many things. I have students, in my own lab, as well as in ASU, as well as other places I know, who have done good work, nothing to be, respectable work, but reasonable impact, and got PhD, understood. And I had students, including one that's defending next week, who has more citations than most people after 5 years of being assistant professor already, and without being one of the co-authors of the TensorFlow paper. Okay, he has the citations without doing that, right? So again, it's a very different thing, It basically allows for so that's the thing. I mean, there is no cookie cutter recipe for good versus bad PhD. I know that people would like it, but their cookie cutter recipes, typically if there's cookie cutter recipe, that essentially means that it's more structured by somebody else. And the whole point of PhD is that you are structuring it. And the good PhDs are, you tend to ask yourself, I mean, somebody might suggest, I mean, you were mentioning it yourself, for example, somebody might suggest the beginning idea, but then at some point of time, it becomes yours. And you care about extending it. You care about what other people's suggestions are about this. And that owning, that, and then figuring out what's the next questions to ask, that is the best kind of PhDs. Okay.
Yeah.
Do you need it all the time? No. In fact, if the world is full of people who want to pick up their own problems, you can't actually have industries. Industries depend on people being told, you are a stem cell and we will tell you what to do and you will do it. Do you see what I'm saying? I mean, even Google, for example, has, I mean, all these companies have multiple different research, applied research, 1, 2, 3, 4, blah, 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 and maybe some kind of a basic research at some level. Not everybody gets to be at the, and even in the case of basic research, somebody, and if you're part of like 80, 175 people group, there's only so much you can, your ideas can, this thing. I mean, it's important. I mean, it's like, without so many people, Taj Mahal couldn't have been built, but it's not very clear that any particular person putting a brick gets to claim too much, other than that, my brick went there, So I think but PhD is the one time in your life where you really get to see whether you have that, both the talent and yearning. I mean, to me, it's very important to have both talent and yearning. I mean, sometimes people have talent and no yearning. Some people have yearning but no talent. And I always think blessed are those whose talents and yearnings match. If you're only good at doing industry jobs and you love industry jobs, you are the happy person. Okay, I can't question your happiness. Right? I mean, it's like the point of life is to be happy, I think, in the end, for all of us. And so if my talents and yearnings match, I'm happy. If I'm in the university and think I wish many more people are using my system, then I'm a sad person, because my yearning is that, deployment, my talents are basically confined to doing open-ended research. And so I should find a different place at that time. So and the same vice versa for the industry. But I think this understanding that research is all about options, some of them are not even actually enumerated, figuring out what those are, what is the next question to ask, and how long is it likely to take, estimating, and how likely is likely to have the impact, again estimating, and actually following through. Those are the things that become important. And I also tend to think, at least in my lab, it's been the case that one of the beautiful things about PhD is you may have an advisor, but your co-students matter a whole lot. And an open lab where people talk to each other, they learn from each other. Students learn from each other a lot more than just one weekly meeting with the advisor, for example. So those are the best practices. I mean, I know that we started this whole thing by, can you define intelligence? Can you define consciousness? Can you define good PhD? And I've been doing the wishy-washy. I can't define any of them. I only can tell you whether one is something. If you present me one, I can tell you whether it's good or bad. As the same thing, and part of that is there is like a reasonable intelligence and there's a high intelligence. There's reasonable thermosflask level awareness, and there is the awareness that we have of our internal things. And there's a reasonable PhD where I hung around for 3-4 years and I kind of stood in front of a couple of people who were basically checking their email and they said, fine, you're passed. And that's also a PhD, right? I think it's really, as I said, if you don't even suit up, you can't win the battle. And PhD is really for those people who want to suit up and see if they are able to get that. And again, it's not just during the PhD, it's like a lifestyle. And the understanding of looking for good problems is something that is useful across the board. And And I think that's probably what I would say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I love the one thing that you mentioned that you started with is basically asking good questions, right? This is something when I started my PhD in 2020. One thing that I was confused about is like what I'm trying to optimize, right? Like if I'm like, okay, tell me if I have to publish papers, that is something I'll be trying to optimize my work over the next 5 years, right? But if, of course, numbers of papers or having publications or citations in the top tier conferences wasn't something on my metric. Then I was trying to figure out what I'm trying to optimize, like how what is the kind of learning I want to direct myself. And one of the things that I stumbled onto was like asking the right questions. Like if you talk to a PhD student versus a person who is like fairly interested into research, the person who is like the latter one won't be able to ask the right questions at the right time, as in like because the person wouldn't have enough breadth of exposure to the field to ask the right questions or ask the most pressing questions, right? Like if I ask some question of let's say if I say I build the best human aware AI system, you might be able to ask me the right questions because you have been in the field for so long. So yeah, I love that idea that you mentioned, like asking the right set of questions maybe defines
And
a
also,
lot about.
but to some extent, you can be the worker ant who is very useful worker ant in building Taj Mahal, okay, and not know what you really did and why you did it. Normally, I start thinking people have become research sentient when they can defend an idea. They almost take it personally when you are talking about the downsides, upsides of their idea. When you start feeling that, then you at least started becoming a researcher. Not every researcher will be having impact, because that's, as I say, like, normally they say that what is luck is opportunity meeting preparation, right? So, so it's like, not everybody is going to have the impact, but if you have to be at least a researcher, and I think I tend to think that people become researchers when they start taking their ideas seriously. It can happen at different times for different people, and that's very different from being a great worker. And that's why in industries they have like they're like amazing software engineers, who just basically listen to what the manager asks and will do that, right? Somebody else is doing the thinking. It's not that it's not important. They're both important. It's just PhD is more about basically doing work that sort of you set the question, you are able to defend why that question is important. And I have this thing about how to give good talks, how to do write papers, etc., like a tutorial thing. I normally think that in general, why is what and why is a lot more important than how. How is important too, but what and why you should be able to. When somebody asks, like for example, you're asking, why should anybody care about explainability? If I haven't thought about why deeply enough, then I'm just doing a work that somebody assigned me, which is a reasonable thing. If somebody else thought about it and they said, do this 15 units of explainability work, I'll do it, right? And then why not ask my boss? Okay. But if when the student is able to answer, essentially, when, why it is important in their view, then they are a researcher, then they're a colleague, right? And then eventually they'll graduate. One of the sad parts of academia, maybe it's a good part, is when they become colleagues, they'll graduate, right? So
Right.
in the sense, exactly when it's like so easy that you can do a lot more than, they'll graduate and go something else, which is fine, but it's like, I chose to be in this where I have fun trying to work with people in the formative stages of becoming a researcher. Not everybody becomes the same level, but when they do, it's just an amazing experience seeing them. Especially because I don't think I was a good researcher after my PhD. Okay, and as I was telling you, I was looking a lot more for the best thesis topic than keeping myself busy and doing more papers and more interesting work. Papers is like, the way of thinking about papers is not about count, but about, can you provide a milestone to yourself as to what you have done?
Right.
Yeah.
But would you say that is a bad fact in the current industry? Like if you have seen job qualifications, like normally when people go for roles after the PhD or during the PhD, they have this minimum requirement of like you should have experience of publishing as a first author papers in NeurIPS, CVP or ICML or something like that. And most of the times people, it's very hard to even publish. Like I'm sure you have seen like CVPN in the last 2 years. It's like a random shot. Like you submit papers, you can get rejected or accepted. It's much more of a random shot rather than having a credibility over there. Do you think this is an increasing concern for people who are in this
I don't know.
domain?
I mean, I think these things come and go. I think people are essentially standardizing this stuff in a weird way. Again, most of the important questions in life are not really fully quantifiable, but civilization progresses by quantifying things, okay, whether you like it or not, right? I mean, so I'm saying both ways. I mean, like we do need to kind of, I mean, IQ is a stupid way to measure intelligence, but it's a way. Otherwise, we didn't even have a number, and so I think industry is sort of trying to standardize. Before it would be subjective, everybody will interview you and then they'll try to take a vote or something without anything. Now they can actually say, well, you are not being hired because you did badly in this coding interview or something, or that you have one less paper in ICML. This bean counting has always been very unsatisfactory across the thing, I mean, in general, but on the other hand, people do it. I mean, I can understand why people do it, because you don't know. I mean, it's like, why do we count the complexity of software in terms of number of lines? It's the stupidest measure, but if you say I'm not going to consider any measures, then in essence, you are saying all software programs, the Microsoft Windows versus the Hello program I wrote, they're all equally indistinguishable. So you are at least trying to make this thing. But the problem about these kind of bean counting measures is, as you may know, of the Murphy's Law, which I think it's Murphy's Law. No, I think somebody else, Goodhart's Law, which essentially says that when a measure becomes a metric, it loses its effectiveness as a measure. That's the thing, because once you tell me that what you're looking for is ICML papers, NeurIPS papers, etc., I'm no longer thinking about what I'm doing. I'm thinking about ICML papers, NeurIPS papers. How many ICML papers did, for example, AAAI papers did Jeff Hinton have? Right? He started his own conference after a while, essentially. Okay, so sometimes you can actually be doing work that nobody is ready to accept. So it's the funniest thing. I mean, I remember when he got Turing Award, from AAAI, we sent him like, congratulations, I was like the past president by then. And then he got back and he remembers, he said, thank you very much, but here is my 2008 review from one of my 2008 papers, where the reviewer said the following stupid bad things about my paper. Please tell that reviewer that I now got a Turing Award. I mean, seriously funny in that sense. I mean, I don't know. But my point is, one, he didn't particularly care about the metric and that thing, right? I mean, so, but I don't begrudge grad students living by the metrics, because that's what they know the industry is looking for. And so it's like you have to take, I mean, again, ultimately, I don't know that you can either follow the world, what the world expects of you, knowing that the world is being stupid and, ride the wave, or you can say, I know the world is stupid and basically I'm going to do what I want. And then at least certainly in the short term, you will take a hit. Yeah. Right. And you get to decide. Yeah, each one of us gets to decide on that. Obviously, some good research. I mean, it is true that good research does get published in these conferences. Also, bad research gets published in these conferences. And I understand that, it became like, I think China, for example, has exact quotas saying you must have these many papers in the A-level conferences, these many papers in the B-level conferences, and these many papers in C-level conferences. And, when you make that, it becomes a metric. And then you are essentially going to be planning to the metric. And don't be surprised at that point that there's a profusion of papers that nobody wants to read. I'm not saying that about Chinese authors. It's like now it's everybody is actually realizing. I mean, I graduated with one Ichikai paper in Ichikai 89, one. And then the next year I had 2 AAAI papers. Okay, now the guy that is basically, defending tomorrow has got us like 43 papers that are directly related to his PhD and a whole bunch of papers that he's not even counting. Okay, the world has become very different. In this particular guy's case, he's actually just passionate about what he's doing. I don't think he cared about the numbers. He's actually going to an academic position. But in general, when the metric is well known, people will, it's the same thing. GRE, for example, was generated to look at what they thought was people's quote unquote general level of preparation, and they expected that nobody will prepare for GRE. But then the moment we know that GRE scores are going to be taken by the universities, especially outside of US, where paying a GRE application fee is quite a bit of money for you, and some of the people actually have to go to a different city to give the GRE exam. You're not just going to be willy-nilly going to say, I'll just take an exam. No, you're going to prepare. You're going to prepare by looking at all the old GRE papers and whatever question banks, etc. And then the ETS will say, no, it's illegal to know the question banks, but nobody listens to that. And then essentially what you found is if you prepare for GRE, how well will you do? That's what you're finding as whether GRE is an indicator of some sort of an innate quote unquote intelligence, which it probably never was. Okay. And the same thing now for papers. If previously you would just look at, if people didn't focus on papers, but they still had papers, that means they're good researchers. But now that cat is out. Everybody knows that papers matter. So people are no longer focusing on research, they're focusing actually on papers. And so it may be correlated, but it's not a perfect indicator. And that's just the way. I think coding interviews are the same thing. People would say, coding interviews were the original GREs for CS, but I think in ASU, for example, and I think many universities, master students spend considerable amount of time preparing for the coding interviews. Because why would you take it lightly if this is known to be the big metric? So it's okay, but then it loses its effectiveness, because I know actually people who are like in my own lab, like the most gifted coders, in the long term, failed the coding test. So it can happen. That's just the way it is.
Yeah, definitely. And to add more light to it, like basically, as long as, even if you're not a computer science student, you can find few tracks to improve. Let's say you want to apply at company X, you can just take a few courses, do your 2 or 3 months of these things, and you can pass those bars. So
it's the same thing. It's easier to seem conscious, seem intelligent, seem like a good coder than be one. So different things.
Nowadays it's easy to game the metric rather than actually pass the metric.
But then that's the way these things. There's a supply-demand aspect, and so this is the way these things will work essentially. So there's no point in. I think we can complain about the world, but the world is what the world is. The world is us, and and so I think. Is it ideal? No, it is not. But is there anything as ideal? I don't think so. Ultimately, everybody has their reward metric. And if you would rather just get through the STEM education so that you can have good life, so you hack for Google, but then you'll have a good life afterwards. Who am I to stop that? That's your metric of happiness. And so whatever gives you happiness, you optimize for that reward metric. And then if it is known what the metrics are, you're going to be judged by. There's nothing wrong in, basically just preparing for that. If basically doing that will optimize your reward metric. In the end, the biggest thing would be self-delusion. If you are actually going to be one of those people who would be much happier hanging around on the beach, but then you thought everybody expected you to be a university professor, and so you became a university professor, and you tell yourself, I should be happy, sad for you, right? Because, I think happiness is what you should feel, not tell yourself to feel. So I think it takes all reward metrics to make the world, and it's good that way.
Yeah, no, I love the analogy for measure versus metric. Maybe one thing, at least I'll try to keep on my calendar, or not trying to find the ideal metric, but rather focus on there is some kind of measure that I can live up to in order to have a good PhD. And I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's your student is Sarath, right, who is defending tomorrow. So
yeah,
I think
Sharath Sridharan is the one who is defending on Tuesday. Yes.
Yeah, I remember. I still remember, like from the course of 591, I think, Human Aware AI. Like his explanations were one of the few best explanations for the papers that you used to
Yeah,
give
because
out.
he's already mature. I mean, he has also spent a lot of time. I mean, he did his master's as well as PhD here, and so it's, again, as I said, it's not it's what you want to do, and it's a reward metric. You know, he's the kind of guy who wants to hang around doing even longer time doing research in as a student. And I'm saying, no, you're not getting enough money. You should get out. But you know, it's like ultimately you don't get to tell people what their reward metric should be. You know, but given that, you know, I mean, I still get to say, just as I don't get to tell you what your reward metric should be, I shouldn't be forced to say that you are not good at something that you are not, you don't care about. So I shouldn't have to tell you that you're just as good as Brahms as a musician, or Bach, or Beethoven as a musician. Those guys gave up on everything else in life, just focused on that. I don't know whether they were happy or not, but certainly their reward metric was to do only that, and they were very good, right?
Yeah.
And if you just basically, I mean, there's no real reason for me to judge people because they're happy without being a great musician or a great researcher. Neither do I have any compulsion to tell people who are having great time not doing research that they're also just as good as a researcher as everybody else, right? Because it's just, those are different metrics.
Yeah. Perfect. And let me end this on a very last question, which might be very open-ended. Feel free to take it as in which direction that you want. Is basically taking further step backs into the domain. Is let's say you have a student come up to you and say, Professor Rao, I was recently reading about the DALL-E or any kind of AI model that is performing very great. Let's say, for me, it was like the object recognition, right? Like you have videos and it can annotate cars, streetlights, and everything. That got me interested in AI. And the person says, I'm very much interested and I'm ready to start my career in AI. What would you like to say to him or her? Like, what's the, like, because the reason I ask this question is because, first of all, like the audience that I have is, most of the people are getting started into AI or like kind of a master student into research or something, but most of them drop out when they actually try to learn the mathematics behind it, right? Like the stochastic parts and the discrete mathematics, and they try to drop out of these courses. They find it very boring. What would you say in those contexts?
Again, as I said, I'm not really sure that if you want to do, you know, if you want to do physics and you don't know calculus, it's not worth it. Okay. I mean, there were some times, in fact, George Post, actually, you may have heard of him. He's still associated with the ASU Biodesign Institute, but he hangs around in San Diego. He once said, biology has long become a refuge of people who want to do science but don't know math. Okay. And I actually, honestly, I think to some extent, AI has become a refuge for people who want to do STEM but don't, basically want to do AI but don't know CS. Okay, don't know CS, including coding, including whatever the math, etc., etc. You know, I mean, there are all sorts of different things that you can do with respect to AI, which is not just understanding the, you know, how to make a particular system. Like, for example, different questions, like, you know, if you're doing human factors analysis, it's a very different set of skills than, you know, checking the convergence of a reinforcement learning system, you know, proving the convergence of a reinforcement learning algorithm, or proving that it has a better bound than some other reinforcement learning algorithm. Those are very, very different things. So I think basically saying, I'm not, I mean, it's important to know what you're impressed by, but it's also important to know what are you able to bring to the table.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think the onus is on you, you know, and I think it's like, I'm impressed with DALL-E. Yes, so am I. So what do we do now? You know, so right. And then the different things will require different kinds of background. And honestly, PhD is an apprenticeship. It's not just listening to a bunch of YouTube videos and being interested. That would be the way you get interested. But eventually, you essentially become an apprentice with somebody and some group I think, which basically is doing certain things, and they're not going to change their direction completely, right? And so you find the nearest neighbor with respect to your incomplete understanding of what your interests are, and then try to work with that group to do more significant, the more concrete work. And it's a hard, difficult thing, but most things in life you have to make irrational decisions without having all the information. Like imagine finding a life partner. Show me the entire video of my life with this partner, and then I'll decide whether or not I'll choose this partner. That's not going to happen. You jump in, and then there's a big setup cost, because you can of course get divorced, but it's kind of higher setup cost. So we do make these irrational decisions. The big things in life are like that, and I think figuring out who are you going to work with for PhD is somewhat of an irrational decision. There might be certain, when my father-in-law, who passed away 2 months back, used to say that, if there's a big decision, take a piece of paper, write 2 columns, pros and cons, throw the paper out, make the decision. so the pros and cons, just saying that I thought about it, but individually. In fact, there's another way of this where people say that oftentimes we don't quite know what we want, and so there's this other way where people say that if you are trying to decide between A and B, and they're important decisions between A and B, and you don't know which one to pick, then you toss a coin, and before the coin falls down, ask yourself, what would I wish it had fallen down on?
Yeah.
That's your actual internal, unverbalized or unacknowledged preference. And we do this, that sort of a thing. And so, and of course, you could be wrong. Because these are just irrational preferences. There's no full, because future, you can't decide how things work out in future, because it's an open world, it's things. So you have your current interests, and, there is a whole bunch of other things. And so my sense in general, in those kinds of cases, especially for PhD level research, is you talk to the other students in the group, talk to the people that you're trying to work with, trying to get a sense, and then make a plunge. Actually, some other people say that, all PhD research is jumping into the deep end of the pool and trying to learn to swim. And that's not a bad analogy, honestly. Except that the only thing is that you won't sink. That's a good thing, because as I say, everybody eventually, almost everybody eventually get a PhD if they hang around in the program. There are very, very few people, if you look at the statistics, there are very, very few people who are actually rejected at the defense level. There have been bad cases in the history, etc., but normally it never happens. And it almost never happens in computer science. But you probably want to do PhD. There's a time cost. You just decided to spend, 4 or 5 years of your prime life, in doing this, as against making a lot more money. And so you have to ask yourself, really, is that really, aligning with your reward metric? And,
Yeah, I love this conversation. I think I could go on and on, but I think in the interest of time, I'll take a pause. But to be honest, like this was one of the most longest, but in terms of philosophical aspect of the conversation, I think this was the best conversation I had, like the philosophical aspect of AI and also the other part of doing a good PhD.
Mhm.
So yeah, thanks a lot. I think now it makes sense why I've heard the so much about the course 471, the intro to AI, about you. I unfortunately did not have a chance to take that, because with masters, like, we have to take a lot of other courses which are mostly 500 plus. But now it makes sense why people enjoy that course. And it that was one of the reasons I wanted to ask this question, as in, like, how would you motivate, or at least I won't say motivate, but at least direct or steer a person who is fairly interested into AI, and how that person should take forward. So it completely makes sense, and I think this would be in the repository of YouTube forever. So yeah, thanks a lot for doing this. And I'll be leaving links to your blog articles, and most importantly, your Twitter, something I personally enjoy a lot from your impromptu tweets, because in my Twitter honestly has become like an academic Twitter, where I can tune into thoughts of people like you
that's
who
actually
can.
a great way to figure out. AI has become that, and there are enough fast developments that I actually call myself, I think that's what I say, that I twitch. which is I try to teach. So, I mean, that's what I feel like doing. I may or may not be a good teacher, but I have the yearning to be a teacher. And so I think, yeah, that's basically what I said in my last lecture that I once gave, like 2011 or something, that even when, when we used to play, like as kids, we would play games, and, I would like, many of our games used to be me being a teacher, even though I would say being a doctor would have been probably more interesting, but I would play the being a teacher game. And it was, for some strange reason, I like that. And, that's what I do for real life as well as Twitter, I guess. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely appreciate that. And yeah, I'll be leaving those links in the description for anyone who want to, and also your YouTube channel. I think there are some very good courses for people who are stumbled onto the first milestone of their AI journey. So I'll be leaving to that. But apart from that, thanks a lot. I think for people who are listening, this is useful, and thanks a lot, Professor Rao, for being here.
Thank you.